Good morning, everyone. I'm Margot Shaw. I'm the editor-in-chief of Flower, and we're here today for our 9th annual ADAC in Bloom. It's a little bit different format, as you have gleaned already, and thank you all for registering and for attending virtually this morning. I do want to mention that ADAC is open for business, so y'all go. This morning, our first speaker is a friend of mine, Carl Dellatore, who is going to tell you more about himself. I'm just going to give you a few little highlights. He's from Allentown, Pennsylvania, one of my favorite Billy Joel songs. He now lives in wonderful Providence, Rhode Island, where they narrowly escaped destruction from the storm. He's here, his internet's working, it's all good. And Carl has such an interesting background. I'm going to let him tell you, but first and foremost, he's here to present you the beauty of his third book, Garden Design Masterclass. He's going to tell you about Interior Design Masterclass and how all of this came about. He is an absolute exquisite curator of talent and is a very, very talented person all unto himself. So we're in for a treat. Carl, I would like for you to tell us where this all began and how you got the idea for these masterclass books, and just where did this spark happen for you, first of all, in terms of, I'm a creative, I want to capture beauty. Where did that start?
Good morning, Margot. So I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and I have to tell you, from day one, I was a sort of creative person, insatiably creative. I have terrible hand-eye coordination, but if you gave me a couple of crayons, I could do an Easter card in 15 minutes. You know, it was just sort of always in me to be creative. And I moved to New York in the early 80s. And I dabbled in lots of different creative things before I ultimately settled on textile design. And I had a career in that. And then I suppose I started an upholstery and curtain factory in the 90s, and that went for 20 years. And during the time I was doing that, I met Martha Stewart and started a relationship with her. And I was on the television show with her pretty regularly, and created magazine content for her. And then I worked for House Beautiful, and I created I did a column there for 3 years called Swatch Watch, where we took one piece of furniture and upholstered it 9 different ways in a genre. So red florals, and that column ran for 3 years. And at the end of it, Marion McAvoy, the editor, said, "Carl, let's make a book out of this." It was so popular, so we did. Well, and then in 2008, the economy went south, and my business went with it. So I was tasked with a reinvention. Having had a book already, I thought, well, I'd like to do another book. But what I really wanted to do was go to formal design school, which I had never really. I went to fine art school. I was a printmaking major, but I wanted to learn about design. But you know, I was nearly 50 and sort of set in New York, and how do I do this? And then one day it sort of dawned on me that I could create another book and go to design school at the same time, because I had relationships with many designers in the community. And I thought, what if I went to each designer I know and asked them to teach me about one subject: scale, proportion, color. And then what if I chronicled the experience in a book? And so I wrote a proposal for a book called Interior Design Masterclass. Rizzoli bought it. And then I set about 2 years of working with nearly every famed interior designer in the country, and asked them to teach me about something, and wrote about the experience. And that's how Interior Design Masterclass happened. And then that book did so well, Rizzoli said, "We'd like to do another book or 2 with you. What do you think might be next?" And so I thought about it, and as long as I was going to design school, why not garden design school as well and recreate the same model? And so this time I went to 100 famous gardeners and around the world, really, and asked them to teach me about one subject. And that's how this book came to be.
So this is not all garden designers though, right? You have some people across the disciplines.
Yeah, and that's a thing. In interior design masterclass, it's all professional interior designers. But in the garden design book, I thought, well, there are so many people who are absolutely passionate about it. People like Charlotte Moss, our mutual friend Charlotte, and Carolyn Rome, and her vegetable garden. And so I started thinking a little bit more outside the box and who might be able to contribute something. And Charlotte Moss wrote about, a very poetic essay about the color green. And Carolyn Rome, who has, I had no idea, has this enormous vegetable garden, wrote all about it in her essay. So I tried not to limit myself and to be as, curious about who was really into gardens as I could be.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have learned, and we're all getting the benefit of your gathering up these amazing talents. So why don't we show everybody just a glimpse of what we're talking about?
Okay, it'd be great. So this first image really sort of encapsulates what the overarching theme of the book turned out to be. It's curious when you go to 100 people and ask them their thoughts about something, sooner or later threads start to appear between different designers' writings. And this is a garden by Edwina von Gall. And when I first got to working with her, she has the Perfect Earth Project, which is an organization that promotes pesticide-free gardens. And I suppose if there was one overarching theme in the book, it's that naturalized gardens seem to be the trend. Less pesticides, more focus on things that are sustainable. And this is a garden, East Hampton, that she did in that theme. This is another garden by Edwina, which also is of that theme. If you look closely at the foreground of this image, you can see the clover and what one might consider a weed or two, right? Because Edwina is really clear that that's part of the natural ecosystem, and removing them is sort of an imposition on Mother Nature that she doesn't really necessarily think is valuable. And
she's an artist, and she's
artist.
such a wonderful environmentalist as well, along with being a great garden designer. Her work is just so holistic, and you feel like nature has not been disturbed at all, just gently, which is really, that's quite a gift.
Edwina had a protege named Abby Lawless, who then went out on her own. And this is a garden that she did, which I really, in that theme of naturalized spaces, this was actually once a lawn. It's of a property on the North Fork of Long Island. And all of these plants in the foreground of this image were actually part of the lawn to the house. And the clients made Abby aware that they really didn't want to have to maintain the property. And Abby wrote about the idea of regeneration and gardens that regenerate the environment, again, in that theme of naturalized gardens. And so they removed the lawn completely and put in a perennial garden there. It's just so beautiful and really looks undisturbed from what might be a natural environment, but it's gardened. It has been.
That's so appealing, especially now. And we're in the South. I'm in the South, and historically we've had really bad droughts in the summer, and not this year, luckily. I don't think I could have taken all that dryness with everything else that's going on. So we're lush down here right now, but usually it's really, really dry, and something like this is so appealing to not have to water your lawn. We have a big lawn to just be able to toss that. It looks like it's tossed out there. We know it's not, but just to have that naturalized look that you don't have to tend to all the time, and you don't have to replant. It's just really appealing and very of the moment. So beautiful.
Yes. And so along that lane, Helen Basson wrote about sustainability and the idea that we should choose plant material that belongs in the environment. So not trying to impose plant material in an environment where it's not sustained by the soil and the climate. And I thought this was just a pretty picture of a garden that looks as though it has been there always, but indeed was designed. And then finally, on the idea of place, which I think is also a theme in the book, making sure that the plant materials that you choose are really almost, I guess in the vein of a zone, you know, designers, nobody wrote about zones for the book, but there's this theme that choosing plant material that belongs in the environment you live in. And this is a garden by Lauren Springer and Scott Ogden. And this is one from them as well, a more subtropical planting. Mm-hmm. Very pretty.
You know, it's really quite a challenge to design so that it doesn't look designed.
Right.
And all three of these designers, or four, it sounds like, have really achieved that. And I think that's almost harder than doing, you know, a really beautifully designed topiary garden or parterre garden or whatever that's more formal. Informality is more challenging, and so to me all the richer and more interesting.
Right. That's an interesting segue, because I worked with a dozen designers in the UK, and on the subject of informality, this is the garden by Dan Pearson in the UK. Just breathtaking. And when I first reached out to Dan to be involved in the book, back up a bit. Ginny Blum originally asked if she could write about the idea of informality. And then Dan was so emphatic about wanting to write about informality that I went back to Ginny and I said, would you ever consider writing about something else? And so ultimately we did, but Dan wrote about this idea of informality and just this subject that we're talking about, the gardens that look as if they're just happenstance and casual. And I mean, who wouldn't want to come home to this garden every day?
Yeah. And it's just so organic and inviting, and it kind of wraps you, and it wraps the house. It's not severe at all. It's very beckoning, and it's, I saw Dan Pearson's work at the Chelsea Flower Show about 5 years ago. He won the gold medal, and he did a rockery from Chatsworth, and he literally transported plant materials and rocks and not the water, but he had a little rill coming through it. It was just superb, and along these same lines, very natural, and you know, the way God created it, and here it is, you can't improve on that. And so this has achieved that as well. Makes perfect sense. And there's a little walk I can see, so there is access to the house.
Yeah. But it's softened by the plant materials so beautifully.
Yeah, it really is.
So this goes along a stream bed, another garden by Dan Pearson that goes along that same sort of vein of informality. Looks happenstance.
It does.
It just sprouted from the earth by itself, but indeed it's been organized. And finally, one more garden by Dan Pearson. And you know, one of the things that I think is most striking about his work is the color sensibility. Of course, it's enhanced by the photography, but this sort of dusty gray purple and sage green, and then the stone color of the walls, it feels just so welcoming.
And he does always seem to have a few little pops of these errant pinks or whatever those are. I can't tell what they are, but which keeps it from being, you know, just sort of this calm palette. You have these punctuations of color that are surprises and sort of sassy. I love that.
Right. So then, staying in England, this is a garden that was designed by Ginny Blum, who I just mentioned.
Amazing.
And I told you this story, but when I first got involved with working with Ginny, she said she wouldn't write about informality then, because that would be Dan, but she wanted to write about the English garden. And I thought, okay, how are you going to encapsulate the English garden in 750 words? Because each designer in the book has 750 words to teach their lesson.
That's so great. What a challenge.
So she came back to me, I don't know, a week or two later, and she said, I think the ultimate lesson about the English garden is really not about its happenstance or blousy roses or you know, what one might consider. It's that the English garden is defined by democracy. And I said, well, what would you mean by that? And she said, well, the postman and the Prince of Wales are on equal footing when it comes to gardens in the UK. They have an equal interest, and even a small plot of land can become something regal in the UK. And I thought that was really inspiring.
That reminds me of Green Fingers. If y'all have not seen that movie, try to find it. It's with Clive Owen and Helen Mirren, and it's sort of loosely based on Rosemary Berry and an open prison where the prisoners started to garden, and then they ended up going to Hampton Court.
Wow.
Show. So anyway, Green Fingers. Yeah, it's all about the democracy of gardens.
So then another garden by Jenny Bloom. I think this is sort of one of the most iconic images from my book. You know, it's a 15th century house. Just beautiful. And for me, I mean, I think if I could think of one picture that says English garden, this would be it.
Yeah. It's pretty iconic.
Right.
Yeah. And this is Jenny Bloom as well?
Yes, ma'am. That's Jenny Bloom.
Okay.
So then another British gardener. This is a curious story. So Tanya Compton, who's in the UK as well, I left a message for her and I sent an email asking her if she'd like to contribute to the book. And ultimately she said yes in an email. And then I was waiting to hear back from her, and I was on 7th Avenue in New York, where I was still living at the time. I had my earbuds in and the phone rang. And I answered it. I didn't recognize the number. It was international, but I didn't recognize it. And the first thing she said, "Carl, this is Tanya. I want to write about insects because nothing happens before the insects arrive."
That's so true.
And I was sort of like the emphasis of it all. So it was a 15-minute phone conversation in the pouring rain in New York City on 7th Avenue because I was so spellbound by the conversation that I just stopped with my umbrella and I listened. And so she wrote about how insects are so integral to the garden. And this is an image from her from the book.
Beautiful. There's nothing like listening to someone who's passionate and knowledgeable about a subject. So good for you. Good for you. I haven't read that chapter yet. I look forward to it.
And that's a really curious thing to mention about this book, you know, the passion behind the people who contributed to this book. So Todd Longstaff Gowan, for example, wrote an essay that I thought was really inspired. But as an editor, as you know, we have to try to find a way to, you know, massage content sometimes so that it fits. And he was so emphatic and passionate about what he wrote, we ultimately printed it verbatim. No changes.
Good for you.
He was so, you know, and I had to respect that.
Yeah.
So this is also Tanya Compton, The Garden by her. And then another insect, which she identifies in the book. I'm afraid I'm not that well versed.
It's a butterfly.
Yes. So, and then this is Arabella Lennox Boyd's garden at her house at Gresgarth Hall. And Lady Arabella wrote about the idea of borders for my book. These topiaries I thought were so interesting.
Fabulous.
I mean, and I have to say, I've made a little note on my bucket list that this is I have to get there before I leave.
Yeah.
Right? I would have to see the garden in person.
I love the mix between the really severely manicured, clipped topiaries and then these drifts of wildness beyond. It's very, very impactful.
Right.
Beautiful photograph, by the way, with just that glimpse of the house. Yeah.
And then this is also a border by Lady Arabella. And when I was talking to her, she began telling me about the relationships. This was really an essay about the relationships between plants in a border, and height and color, and also the progression of time. She talks about how in a border, it's important to make sure that things are peaking at different times of the year, and also that there be something left for the winter. So the grasses in this particular image will remain throughout the winter months.
You know, I notice you talk about themes and threads. There are grasses in almost every garden, wild grasses now. That's really a fun, beautiful, of the moment trend that I think is here to stay.
Right. I would agree.
Yeah.
And then finally in the UK, this is a garden in London by Todd Longstaff Gowan. And Todd wrote, who I just mentioned, he wrote about the idea of pattern. And not something I would have expected, but ultimately about leaf patterns and structure patterns and how they help us to make sense of a garden. And this one in particular, having the stag at the back end of the garden along a haphazard path, the pattern of leaves draw you into the garden slowly towards the stag. It's a really inspired and I would say perhaps heady essay that he wrote, and really informative.
What a focal point, too.
Right.
Wow, yes, fabulous.
And it is, I should also mention, this is a fairly postage stamp sized garden. It looks monumental, but it's actually quite small.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
Clever. Yeah, great. Oh, I see. Wait, just for a second.
Yes, ma'am.
Those are two terraces with what, ivy or something growing up them? Do you see the column?
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Love that. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. And so then there was this idea. I began thinking about the lessons I learned in this book. And this is actually by Scott Schrader in Los Angeles, this garden.
He's
and it's the very front entrance to the house, which is to the back of the image on the right. And so Scott wrote about the idea of the alternative front garden, that the front of the house does not have to be this prescribed sort of vision, that you can have another view, to think differently. And so the stone path meanders. And again, you just mentioned the grasses here that soften the edge of it. And to come to the front of a house this way sets the tone for your experience in the house.
And so even your approach is fanciful and is an experience. It's really delightful.
And he was really a joy to work with. His book came out in September, if I'm not mistaken. He did a monograph on his gardens, which is really quite pretty.
I think we featured him in Flower.
Right.
When I got to know his work, he's a master.
And then I guess we'll go to Charlotte Moss's garden in East Hampton. So Charlotte is a friend of yours and mine. And I actually wanted to try to chat with her about this picture this week, but we didn't connect. But this is her private garden in East Hampton. And she wrote about the idea of green. And when I think about things I learned from the book, is that in this particular essay, that green is not sort of just there. It's something to be appreciated and acknowledged in the garden. That it's almost that the undertone that you might miss because it's so omnipresent, but to really pay attention to the idea of green and the myriad colors of green that there are.
Yeah, and she really, you know, this was a spec house that she and Barry bought, and she just kind of had her way with this land and made it hers. And it is an exquisite garden. But those treillage, are they pears or apples?
Apples, I think.
Apples. Yeah. She told us the story. She did a presentation for us on a garden tour in England, and she said that she found those, I think, in Italy, and bought them and had them shipped home. And the night before they were due to arrive, she hadn't told Barry about them, her husband. And so she fixed a you know, gourmet dinner and plied him with Suave, and then, you know, revealed that what was about to arrive the next day. And he, of course, loved him and was thrilled. But it's interesting how we see something that captures our imagination, and we have to have it. I mean, those are exquisite and beautifully done. And she did have to take out some boxwoods, I think, to put that in, but I'm so glad she did.
Right. I also think there's a really interesting rhythm between the arborvitaes in the back being conical and the circular forms of the espalier.
Very
really
geometric.
Yeah.
Interesting.
This is also Charlotte's garden in East Hampton. And thinking about the subject green, this is sort of like the quintessential image for me. There's so many colors of green in it, and no flowers, but it's just a beautiful space.
Very natural too, even though you have the boxwoods. The collar around the bottom of the tree is just, it looks like it grew up out of the ground.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So then this is Michael Trapp's garden in Connecticut. Do you know Michael?
I do. I've met him at Trade Secrets, and I've seen him there every year until this spring. And I've seen his shop, which is like a sewn museum for the botanical flower person and antiques, and so this makes perfect sense. I mean, he's so talented and has such an unerring eye.
Yeah, yeah.
So this fits right in with his ethos.
And he wrote about the idea of the small space garden in the book.
Yeah.
And it's another sort of, this image belies the reality because it's a very small garden. He has, as you mentioned, a shop that's just the most beautiful, curated store. And we happened upon it. And then the woman who worked there told me that there was a garden behind the store, which I sort of could see, but we weren't allowed to go. She couldn't let us go see it. So we ended up reaching out to Michael and going back to see the garden. And then I asked him if he could write about the small space garden. And one of the interesting things I took away from that essay is that in small spaces, the rooms are what is important. That to define the walls and ceiling of a garden, which he does here with the wisteria, is really important so that you feel enclosed and that it doesn't sort of spill out. This is also from his garden in Connecticut. And this is really the smallest little sliver of land. But it is just makes you travel through this space as if you're in Italy, it seems.
It looks very Italian.
Yeah.
I love that one corkscrew topiary at the end too. Just sort of a little fillip, a little exclamation point, with all the really not rigid, but all the straight lines and the cypress columns, and then this little squiggle at the end. It gives it a little bit of humor.
I agree. And then Nancy Power. This is an image from Nancy Power in Los Angeles, who could not have been more gracious in working with me on this book. We ultimately settled on the idea of light is what she would examine in her essay. And she writes about how without light, we can't really understand space. And we can't understand space and light without shadow, and that how important it was. She talked about the idea of when she takes a new commission for a garden, she finds a place to sit and she'll spend 2 or 3 hours a day and then come back the next day at a slightly later hour in the day and sit for another few hours just to watch how the light changes over the course of the day before she does her plantings. And that's another sort of, wouldn't have been the first thing I would have thought about someone to write about, but it's a poetic essay about how important the basic idea of light is.
It's just like in interiors. Lighting is sort of the unsung hero of a beautiful room. And you notice if it's bad, you don't if it's good, you just know you feel good there.
Right.
So, yeah.
You know, on the subject of light, going back to interior design masterclass, Victoria Hagen in New York wrote about the subject of light for that book. And in the end, you know, one of the things I try to get people to understand is with 750 words, you have to identify what it is the lesson is, and then try to find a way to write it in that short amount of words to support the idea. And so Victoria said to me at the end, she said, you know, really, I think what's most important about light is that it never goes out of fashion. It's the omnipresent element in interiors, and again in gardens too, that you might skip over, but is really omnipresently important.
Agreed. Agreed with Victoria.
Let's see, oh, this is also a garden by Nancy Power. Just astonishing. And we've been talking about this idea of happenstance, that things look as if they've been there forever. It does not look as though there's the hand of the maker in this garden at all to me, but it's just so beautiful.
And the irises, just, I mean, it'd be pretty without them, but it's just such a nice little intersection of color and green. It's just beautiful.
So let's see. So then the last sort of idea about the book, another theme that kept carrying through was the relationship between the landscape, architecture, and people. And this is a garden by Isabel and Julian Bannerman. And they wrote about architecture in the book and how the relationship of the natural environment and the hardscape, the building, and was so important. And this is just such an incredible image to me.
What is, it's not a folly. It looks like you could really settle there. What is that?
I think it is a folly.
Okay.
It's a room, certainly a
Okay.
room.
Yeah.
And then also on the subject of architecture, this was a remarkable space. Also the garden by Isabel and Julian Bannerman.
Where is that?
This is in the UK, in the South, I think.
Gosh, really?
Maybe not.
No, no, it just looks very exotic.
Oh, because of the tropical plants.
Yeah, and well, the architecture.
I have to find, I'm sorry, I don't know the
That's
answer.
okay. That's okay if you don't know your own book.
It's in the caption, I'm sure.
Listen, don't ask me to tell you where things are in my book now. And
this
him
is
as well.
This is also Isabel and Julian Bannerman. And I'm fairly convinced this one is in the UK.
You know, I can't take my, the flowers are beautiful and the lupines and the borders and everything, but I go straight to that pediment.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what's in there?
I think, you know, I want to say staghorns.
Okay.
I want to say
that makes sense. Yeah.
In that, the triangular space.
Yeah. Beautiful. Clever.
And then from the UK back to New York, this is Ed Hollander, a garden by Ed Hollander. And he wrote about ecologies in my book, and he identifies three: the human ecology, the natural ecology, and the architectural ecology. And that these three sort of ecosystems need to work together. And the house to the right opens onto this patio, and then this incredible dining space and an outdoor fireplace. I mean, this sort of sings between the architecture sings with the garden, and then you can almost imagine the humor interaction when there's a garden party there.
That looks like a great scene, you know, where you as the director would people it with a cast of colorful people and just see what happens. Stand back.
So this is also a garden by Ed Hollander. And this relationship of the architecture to the garden, I thought was so interesting. And the curious note about Ed has a big business in New York on Union Square. And, you know, it's got, I don't know how many employees, and everyone's whirling through, and it's busy, busy, busy. He does incredible gardens in the Hamptons. And I cannot tell you what a charming, interesting, engaging man who, it was as if nothing else was happening around us when I was at his office. I went to meet with him twice. So generous of time and spirit.
It's really admirable and impressive when people who are that busy and that gifted and that successful can really hone in on you and bracket out the rest of the world and give of themselves. It's quite impressive and very important.
Right, I agree. And then the last garden in my presentation, it's sort of like land, if I could go anywhere and live for the rest of my life, it's this garden, which is Paul Bangay's garden in Australia.
Yeah.
And Paul writes about travel in Garden Design Masterclass, and not necessarily travel as I went to Italy and I learned something. It's traveling through the space. And the key takeaway from his essay is that the further away from the house you go, the more naturalized the garden should be, and that the closer one gets to the architecture, the more controlled the garden should be. And that's evident. He has property that extends to the back of this image, but as you get closer to the house, and certainly the front doorway, things are more manicured and controlled. And in the rest of the images, as you travel out into the natural environment, things are less controlled. And I hadn't really given that much thought.
I follow him on Instagram. I'd never heard of him, I must confess. And that is the beauty of Instagram. I have learned and become acquainted with so many great creatives, and he's one of them. I go to his stream whenever I can. Right.
And this is, if I had to pick one image, and I couldn't because there's so many, but if I had to pick one image that really spoke to me, it's this one. I, as a textile designer, I'm always drawn to geometric form. So this garden is just remarkable. Also Paul's. And the afternoon light is just astonishing here.
That's really dreamy. Is this his house? Is that what
Yeah.
you said? It's his house
Yeah.
as well. And where is this situated on the property?
This is behind the house. This image, let's go back for a minute. This is the entry to the house.
Okay.
I also happen to love that little waterfall that travels, that water feature that travels to the front door.
And what, wait, go back.
Hmm?
What are those little coiled up snakes at the
Oh,
head of the grill?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's called snake sculpture.
Okay. I'm not a snake lover, but that's pretty. Okay.
I don't know that it would be my first choice, but you never know. So that's what I have on the book today, Margot.
Well, I think that's a really good representation of this book that I only got to flip through it when we got it at the magazine, but I plan to pore over it now after this. And I think you've taken us on a wonderfully enjoyable and informative and inspirational journey through parts of your book. And so I want to actually find out if there are any questions. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, I know there are some, I just can't get to them. Let's see. Okay. What is in the foreground? Snakes. We just talked about that. Okay, I answered your question, someone. Okay, any other questions? Well, I have one.
Go ahead.
Oh, Cindy Cantley said she just ordered 3 books. Yay. Are there good ornamental grasses for shade? Did you learn anything about that?
You know, to be honest, I didn't, but I did, not from the book, but I went to a plant nursery close to where I live in Providence recently, because in the design studio I have, there's a retaining wall outside the window, and there's this, I don't know, 30 inches wide strip of land, and I wanted to put some grasses in there. And so I don't know the name of it, but there are indeed grasses for shade, because they recommended 2, which I planted outside my window, and they're thriving.
So, okay, well,
I guess I would just ask a plant nursery, right?
Yeah. Now, after all of this, though, I'm sure we're all going to go and start finding grasses that are going to work in our gardens, because they're just a great sort of contrast, and they're so graceful. So we would like to know, someone would like to know if you have one. Just went up. Do you have a style that is your favorite of these gardens?
Well, one that I didn't talk about, Luciano Ghibli in Italy wrote about the Italian garden. And myself, I mean, this is just me, and Joseph Merrick in Los Angeles also wrote about flowerless gardens. And I've always been curious about the idea of having a garden without any flowers at all. At all about the texture and the color. So that would be my preference. What about you, Margot? Do you have a favorite?
You know, because my husband's here, I'll have to say our garden.
Okay.
He's the gardener, and we have a little cottage, and very informal, and we have sort of a looser, wilder garden that looks informal and sort of organic, but it's not, because he works his you-know-what off, and so that would be my favorite. But I'm really enamored of, I would say, Edwina von Gaal's, that first property with all the grasses and then flowers that sort of crop up here and there that look spontaneous. I just think that's a masterful achievement and a really interesting look. But I've got someone who wanted to answer about the shade grasses, northern sea oats, and a lot of the sage grasses as well. So someone would love to know how long you spent working on your book.
2 years. start to finish 2 years. And so because there were 100 gardeners in 6 countries, it's sort of a logistical thing, you know, getting everybody on board and getting the first drafts in, getting the images, as you know, working with photographers to secure the image rights. These books are sort of epic in the time it takes to get them together, but this one took just over 2 years. I would also mention, if someone wanted to have my signature in the inside of the book, I have signature plates that I can sign, and I'll put one in the mail to you if you message me on Instagram, and it's Carl Dellatore. If you private message me on Instagram, I'm happy to put one in the mail. I've done that quite a bit through the pandemic crisis we've been having. People have written to me and I've said, I'll send one off to you. So if you wanted to get my signature in the book, I'm happy to do that.
Well, I do. So I will get one. I will message you. It's been interesting, you and me both having books and being on a book tour and then screeching to a halt. So we have to sort of pivot and find new ways to move the product and get people to know about it. And the book plate is great. I mean, that's almost as good as getting to meet Carl in person, but at least having it personalized and signed is a great idea. So Alice loved the chapter from Charlie McCormick.
Oh,
so cutting garden. Please talk about that chapter. What are your thoughts on gardens for birds?
Well, Charlie wrote about the cutting garden. He's really famous for his dahlias, and he sent me an image that sort of every once in a while when you work with someone on these books, they send an image that immediately says everything you need to know in one picture. And so he's got a shot of a dahlia border in his garden. He writes about the importance of cutting gardens, and you know, I know another designer, Katie Ritter, who has a cutting garden in Connecticut. I don't have one myself, but I know many people who have large properties, and it's a curious thing about the cutting garden. It's often hidden off to the side because it's a working garden.
Yeah.
I don't know what your experience has been, Margot.
Well, I do not have a cutting garden. Our whole garden is a cutting garden. And, but I have a friend who brought me some zinnias that she grows that are right here. I don't know if you can see these, probably. And so that's a thing now in Birmingham, at least. And I think a lot of other, you know, spots is growing your own. So even if you're not necessarily a gardener, people are starting to grow flowers at home. So, so that's fun. What countries are in the book besides UK, United States, and Australia? What are the other countries?
France and Italy.
France and Italy?
Yeah.
Is that what you said? Okay. Well, those are two good countries for gardens.
Right.
So let's see if there's anything else that I missed. How do you get the boxwood squares lined up? Now I know that was not your garden, but you did talk about geometry, and I wonder what role that plays.
No, that's a good question. I don't know for certain, although I have seen parterres and geometric shaped boxwoods very religious about their shape. I don't honestly know exactly how it's done, although I have watched videos of people clipping hedges with great dexterity, and it would not be me. I assume there has to be some sort of plan laid out.
Yeah. So someone wants to know how you would suggest using this book as a textbook, which is a great idea. I mean, it's a primer in beautiful gardens.
I suppose if I were going to use it as a textbook, I would take one essay at a time of the 100. Start maybe at the beginning of the book and move through the essays one at a time. Yeah. Because one of the great things about these kinds of books is that if you read what Nancy Power has to say about light, there may be somebody else who disagrees with her emphatically, as is often the case with creatives. So I might take one essay in the book and then begin to do research on the internet to see what the alternate ideas might be about it. Say, for example, the alternative front garden that Scott Schrader wrote about. His idea is that it doesn't need to look like the prescribed entrance to the house. Then you might also look for people who go in the opposite direction and have a very classical approach.
compare and contrast.
Right, right.
Yeah, I love that idea. That to me, that mix and that iron, that yin and yang is a great way to learn. And I really like that idea. That is so helpful. Wouldn't you like to be in that class where they're going to use Carl's book as a textbook?
No, go
I
ahead.
think that's it for us today. That's all the time we have. And Carl, I want to thank you for your time and for putting together your presentation so that our ADAC and Bloom audience could experience you and you know, think about you being sort of a Cecil B. DeMille, P.T. Barnum. I'm just gathering all these people, herding these people together and having them distill their style, their thought in the topic that you gave them or that they came up with. It's genius and it's really fun and educational and just inspirational. Thank you. Thank you for all you've done to make.
Thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure to be here.
It was our pleasure as well. So thank you all. ADAC and Bloom audience, we will be back at 1 Eastern time with Rebecca Gardner, the fabulous fairy of Fete and houses. And Carl, I hope you'll tune in and meet Rebecca as well.
That'd be great.
Thanks
Thank
all
you.
again. Bye.